Japan by River Cruise is made possible thanks to those who donate to the show at japanbyrivercruise.com and thanks to the generosity of our corporate sponsors. This week's show starts with a message from the marketing team that got Noto Japan to buy a giant squid with its Corona money, who has just recently changed its name to the marketing team that sold a statue of a giant squid.
Hi. Yeah. We can't believe it either. I'm gonna take a break. I'm off to the Arctic. Gonna go try sell some snow. But when I'm back, give us a call.
Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
And I'm Ollie Horn.
And joining us this week is Chelsea Szendi Schieder, Japanese social activism historian, author of Coed Revolution, whose seminal work on the desegregation of the Japanese riverboat industry forever changed the way we think about members-only boat clubs. Chelsea, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
Last week, we did a controversial show on the definition of visual kei, and we're disappointed to discover that literally no one got mad at us for it online. That's why Chelsea is helping us up the stakes this week with a talk about efforts to revise history and erase Japanese war crimes. Then hopefully next week we can talk about the right-wing backlash that followed said talk. Plus, Ollie's got your weekly river cruise recommendation. Ollie?
Yes, Bobby, this week's recommendation is the Sumida River Cruise in Tokyo, whose port operators, in anticipation of the increase in foreign visitors, have made things considerably easier for them by allowing, finally, full-width as well as half-width boats.
Also, the popular annual river cruise concert, Yotoboizu Session, or as it's commonly called, Yobo Seshu, had to shut down its reservation website after being overwhelmed with traffic for some unknown reason. We'll look into that later, but first, Soap Talk.
Chelsea, you join us just months after your book Coed Revolution was published. How glad are you that you didn't have to do a book tour by virtue of the fact that you still can't move anywhere?
It feels very surreal. I wish I could talk to people about it in person because I have kind of this empty nest feeling. Like the book is out having conversations with other people. I don't know anything about it. It doesn't call, doesn't even come home to do laundry. You know?
And your book focuses on the 1960s and 1970s kind of social movements, and you try to kind of unpack the lost female voices in that era. And I think this topic of student activism is just as live now as it is back in the 1960s. Maybe there aren't these big, enormous, defining revolutionary moments like there was then. But there are, certainly in the past 2 years, we've had huge ones on race equality, on the environment. And do you see the same problems that certain voices are suppressed in these movements occurring now as they did in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that there are maybe two parts to your question because I'm writing about the student movement in Japan in the 1960s. Which is often left out of this story when I would tell people that I work on the student movement in Japan in the 1960s. People would be like, oh, Japan had a 1960s, had a student movement, had a new left, had feminism. That part of the question is there is a student movement in places like the US or the UK or Europe, elsewhere, but not really in Japan. And there are the same problems in Japan, especially if you start talking about environmental problems or even the fate of higher education or racism, sexism, these things. So, I think these issues are very alive today. And I think that's because young people are really at this pressure point between social expectations. They're supposed to do a certain thing to get some kind of success in the future. But then also they're facing the fact that the kind of future's up to them and they're thinking about these things in this different way. And I think that tends to feed a lot of student movements. But then the question is why that's not really happening in Japan.
Do you think that there's a difference between people being concerned with politics and being politically active?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I think that what interested me in doing this research is that I kind of entered into the research thinking naively there was a social movement. There were a lot of activists in the 1960s, 1970s in Japan, and there aren't now. And the fact is that there are always activists being activists. It's just how much of a platform they get, how much they are able to attract a larger movement.
What do you think the issues are that prevent people from being aware of political activism in Japan? I think a lot of people have the idea that Japan is not politically active, that there is no movement.
Well, I think, and this may be self-serving, and this may be me being a hammer looking for a nail, but I do think that if we look at the 1960s and early 1970s in Japan and see how vigorous that movement was, but then also how extremist it both was, and also how extremist it became painted or represented as, you get the sense of why people who are activists in Japan are actually very shy of using the word katsudoka or activist. It sounds very extremist.
It's so funny that you preface that by using the phrase hammer looking for a nail, because in Japan, it's the nail that sticks out like a katsudoka that gets hammered down.
Oh my God, absolutely. I'm the hammer that is looking for the nail that is sticking up so I can pull up some other nails to help them stick up some more.
and help them form a union.
Yeah, I mean, the hammer has two sides. You can nail it down, but you can also kind of, screw it up a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now that hammer looks a bit more like a sickle. The narrative works.
So you have kind of a unique perspective on Japan issues because of your historical scholarship. And I noticed on Twitter that you had a different take on you had a different experience of that Takarajima-sha ad that went out.
Yeah.
That politics is killing us ad.
Yeah, well, I mean, I realized that my exposure is very curated, I suppose, because very soon after that ad came out, many people commented on it. I mean, it's very gripping. It's graphically gripping. Historians immediately recognize the font. The kanji for tatakao is a pre-war kanji. And so, within hours, people had gone back and found the source of the photograph and clarified it's not bamboo spears, it's naginata. Oh my gosh, I can't remember.
Yeah,
naginata. Yeah, and that just taught me that I have very carefully curated my Twitter feed, I suppose.
To be full of pedants.
Well, it's huge that advertisement even went out, that
Yes.
this major corporation was willing to take such a political stance in such a public way.
Yes, I've been following the Olympics very carefully because, of course, historians of the 1964 Olympics see it as a moment of pushing away, sometimes forcibly pushing away the wartime memory, pushing homeless war veterans off the street and making sure maimed bodies were kind of cleared from the street and paving the way toward this image of just simply an affluent post-war peace-loving Japan. And so it's quite interesting to reflect upon this Olympics as potentially as being a moment that many people seem quite angry about this. I don't know. This is very unscientific, but I've been asking my neighbors, and I can't find a single neighbor in my Shitamachi area who is really excited about hosting these Olympics.
Well, that is the thing, is that I genuinely don't think there is anybody left that is making a positive case for the Olympics.
Dentsu?
Well, I suppose. But that's not the case for the Olympics.
I heard a lot of people related to the Olympics are expected to be positive.
Good. Ended on a joke. Thank you. People that are rewarding us for that kind of absolute top-tier humour are the people that become monthly members. And this week we need to thank Rick, who bought us 5 coffees. Thank you very much, Rick, for that.
Do we? Because I bought a bicycle from him before he moved back to America. So he still got 30 of my dollars.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, in that case, I don't want to get involved. But he bought 5 coffees and he said, "You guys are all right, I guess," which is fine. We're kind of used to this by now. You take with one hand and give with the other. But maybe Rick felt bad about it because then just moments later he then became a member.
Oh, in that case, he's up on me.
Yeah,
free bike.
Anyway,
Thank
if you want
Rick.
to. Ding ding. If you want to either buy us a coffee or indeed a bike, we'll take any form of transportation as long as it's not buoyant. Please go to buymeacoffee.com/Japan by River Cruise. Thank you very much to everyone that supports the show. Bobby Judo, shall we take a look at the news? Bobby Juno, what's in the news this week?
Well, the Olympics is almost upon us, maybe. And while it's an event that's always held up as a bastion of international harmony, it actually always tends to put a spotlight on international tensions. Living in Japan, I always notice how things like the territorial disputes between Japan and South Korea get litigated in the Olympic venue stands. Chelsea, in terms of Japan and South Korean relations, what are some of the tensions that are kind of simmering in the background this time around?
Yeah, well, from my own recent experience, I would have to say it's the ongoing issues around Japan's colonial legacies in the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah.
Particularly surrounding the case of the so-called comfort women, or former ianfu, which is a euphemistic term that was used during the wartime to talk about women who were employed in a system of basically sexual slavery, because whether they originally volunteered or didn't, whether they got payment or didn't, they could not leave their post. They were coerced. And some of them are still living. Some of them still put cases through South Korean courts. And this really tends to put the Japanese government on the defensive. And the Japanese government tends to play a certain game to its domestic audience, and especially kind of right-wing, ultranationalist, historical revisionist audience, while at the same time to the international audience still saying it upholds the 1993 Kono Statement, which recognized coercion and promised to remember the history of the coercion of comfort women.
So basically a lot is going on then.
Yeah, there's basically a lot going on.
And we're at the stage where, I mean, like you just said, it's very easy if you don't know much about this to kind of think, oh, well, I kind of thought this was dealt with, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I vaguely remember that like there was some statement by the Japanese and that was accepted. And, you know, like the women which are still alive are getting some monetary compensation and something which at least alludes to an apology.
Yeah, more than that, I remember that every time Korea says we demand an apology or we demand reparations, Japan says we already did it.
Yeah, I mean, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website has been revised recently to say that there was no coercion in the English site as well as on the Japanese site. And in the Kono Statement has not been actively retracted. And whenever Abe, when he was prime minister, and Suga, when he was in Abe's cabinet, when they were asked point blank if the Japanese government was going to reverse or step back from the Kono Statement, they've said, no, absolutely not. So there is a tension at work there already, yeah.
While I'm sure we'll talk about kind of the specifics and what gestures have been done or rather not done in the very recent past, this seems to speak to just a general problem that governments have with having to confront their past. Yes. And it seems that it should be the easiest thing to do to a government that has no personal responsibility for this issue to go, yeah, we unequivocally apologize for something real bad that happened a long time ago that we had nothing to do with. It costs them nothing other than some kind of political capital, obviously. That's got to be the reason why they're not doing it. What are the levers that a government can pull? Obviously, they can apologize. They could give money. They could make some proactive steps to, I don't know, to educate. I mean, what are people in the government so scared of doing?
I think it comes down to the education. I mean, there has been an apology. The apology is of questionable sincerity when periodically you have politicians undermining said apology.
Right. Bobby, I'm really sorry for eating your crisps as I'm tucking into this third bag of crisps.
Exactly. I mean, and there have been a lot of discussions about what makes a good apology, and the Japanese government has not followed really any of those guidelines. In terms of the money, the Asian Women's Fund was a private fund, and the Japanese government did contribute money to that, which was then dispersed to many former comfort women. Many comfort women refused to take it because it also gathered money from many private citizens. So it was this idea that it was a way to kind of address the guilt felt by individual Japanese citizens without addressing government responsibility.
Without the government taking the blame.
Yeah, exactly. And whenever I teach about this to my students, who most of whom are Japanese and many of whom were raised in Japan, but interestingly, many of who grew up in Asia and have very different stories about their experience with this. But I asked them if they've heard about the comfort women, and if so, where did they learn about it? And many of them say, well, really, not really in school. Maybe there was a line in a book, mostly from the news. And to me, that's a failure of that problem for education.
Mm.
And so then for me, that question is, well, what does it cost the government? And this is when history is really interesting, is because every subject perhaps is rather ideological. But when you think about in school, when you learn history, it is very different than the way you learn science or you learn math, because it's usually framed around your national history. And it's usually framed with this idea that you're going to have this certain kind of national identity. And it's not framed around what professional historians do, which is deal with sources and evidence, right? It's really kind of framed on like, you should know your founding fathers and you should know these dates and events. And it's either like so deadly dull and so boring and so many just facts and events that people learn to hate it, or it can be just this heritage history.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's the sticky wicket, is like actually inserting it into education. Every time there's been an attempt to get more education about wartime militarism in Japan, the backlash has been so incredible in this country.
It's interesting, this idea of how strongly political ideology in a country is tied into the way it teaches its history. Because as an American living in Japan, one of the things that Japanese people regularly want me to talk about is what I learned about World War II in America.
Yeah.
I get this question all the time, like, what do American textbooks say about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Pearl Harbor?
Yeah.
And I have to go, I'm American. We don't have history textbooks anymore.
Actually, according to some studies by some historians, young people don't even learn history in school anyways. Like, they learn it from TV and movies and grandparents, and like, that's it. you know? So it's like, there's also kind of this part where you're like, well, why are we worrying about what you're learning in school? But I mean, there is this kind of, and that question often even gets framed around Hiroshima or the atomic bomb, when, I mean, the Tokyo fire bombings seems to be the kind of original war crime that paved the way to allowing, forces in America to imagine dropping an atomic bomb on a city.
The thing that I really struggle to understand is what Japanese nationalists think they can gain by suppressing this issue. Like, what is it that motivates them?
In some senses, to me, it's like the biggest case of KY, Kuki Yomenai, where it's just like, you're going to go after statues of young women, like that are popping up around the world. Like, it's just bad from a public relations perspective. A word I see bandied around a lot by denialists or historical revisionists is honor. This idea of national honor. And so that seems to be involved in it. And I also just think that there's this, not just a ethno-nationalist current, but also a misogynist current, where it's like, we can't believe women. Like, women lie.
Right.
You're going to believe this uneducated, Malaysian woman.
Yeah, you could draw parallels here with revisionist history in America, too. The idea of the heritage of the Confederacy, where people use words like pride or honor or history. But among those people, there's a small segment of them, and it might be small, but there's a segment who what it's about is racism. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of, ultra right-wing Japanese nationalists who don't want to acknowledge the comfort women, a lot of it is either misogyny or hatred of Korean people.
Yeah. I have been exposed to a level of anti-Korean hatred that I had heard existed, but wasn't completely aware of. And to the extent, my kid came home from daycare and was like, oh, Dare-dare-kun is Korean. And I know that his dad is Korean. I know that his grandma's Korean. He speaks Korean with them. And But to the point where I was like, what is the context in which you heard that? Because it could just be this like, he's Korean. That's cool. Because because I speak English at home. Or it could be like, oh, he's Korean. And like, I have gotten very sensitized to that. And I mean, I think that's good, because there are people for whom calling someone Korean enough is an insult.
Is the suggestion then that there are some people who are maybe like pleased this happened, more than just they're denying it ever happened? They're saying, yeah, and this is fine.
Well, I think that this is the issue that comes up, and I think the comfort woman is important for global history and global law. So this legal precedent of the comfort woman case becomes important to legal cases in Rwanda and in former Yugoslavia and Bosnia, right? So being able to understand gendered violence, sexual violence during wartime is important for law now. And there are people who say, well, war is hell, whatever. But in our modern period, we've never not had laws about warfare. I did a double negative. We've always had laws about what you can and can't do in warfare. So to say like, well, war is hell, it's all out the window. Or of course women get raped during war because women are there to rape. That I just don't think that's an adequate argument for why we should not try to avoid that.
Yeah, I wouldn't be
sure
that people were pleased that it happened. I think saying that they weren't coerced, they did it willingly, might feed into an argument that some of those people might want to make about, comparative morality or quality of the people in Korea compared to Japan.
To be clear, so first of all, comfort women were from all of the occupied territories under military Japan control. And it really becomes about the Korean women because this has become a big case taken up by the South Korean government.
Right.
But there were Indonesian comfort women, there were Japanese comfort women, there were Dutch comfort women. Tellingly, only the Dutch comfort women got justice in the immediate post-war period, probably because they were white women and it was more about racial boundaries rather than about women.
And was this the Dutch government that spearheaded this?
Yes. These were the trials that were held immediately in the territories when troops came in, and they did kind of field trials.
And so correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that while Korea has taken up this mantle and is using the comfort women issue to score some kind of political points, Singapore and Malaysia and a bunch of other countries could also be doing this on behalf of women that suffered this injustice.
Yes, they could. And I mean, I think that this is also an important moment to think about why there was a lag. It took feminism as a transnational movement, and it took democratization in South Korea for this to become an issue that was spoken about, that women were empowered to speak about it. Many, many women, most former comfort women, have never spoken about it. And again, there's a diversity of experiences in terms of regions, also in terms of coercion. And I mean, some women may have volunteered. And we also have to think about volunteering in the historical context, where it's like, who did anything voluntarily during the wartime period? There are all kinds of levels of coercion.
Okay, so let's do something that we've never ever done before on this podcast and imagine a world where things get better. What should a government do? Well, like, what are the lessons to learn in an ideal situation where there aren't people saying, this is Korean propaganda, this never happened? What is the good example for a country that's committed an atrocity to follow in rectifying the atrocity?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I think that is a millions and dollar question. Actually, in a cynical way, like
in
I think
terms
that
of
sometimes
like
it becomes payments. But I don't think payments. I think that, and especially like the surviving comfort women are quite old. At this point, it is about preserving this history and the memory of what happened to them. And I think that when I teach students about this, I mean, there are many ultranationalists in Japan who say that this is a masochistic history, and they don't want to teach Japanese young people a masochistic history. But when I have had students who are receptive to this history and they want to learn more, and I do not force this down their throats, because I believe in source-based, evidence-based learning, and I encourage students who are interested in this to look at sources and look at evidence. Students who have become interested in this and have continued to do some research about this, I don't believe that they have found this to be masochistic or self-flagellation. I mean, they didn't do this. And even if they had been a 17-year-old boy recruited into the army and then they had raped a comfort woman, they would also not necessarily be the person that I want to hold accountable. It's like wanting to hold people in power accountable. And so I would say it's about holding people in power accountable, and also about being able to see links and causes across borders, because I think it's very empowering for many of my young female students to try to think about this and to read things being published by young women in South Korea now who think about comfort women and Me Too and sexual harassment and sexual violence in South Korea today alongside comfort women.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the example set by countries like Germany, where they confront the history of the Holocaust with very, very strict regimented policies to prevent those kinds of movements again in the future. And it's so effective that there's more neo-Nazism in America than there is in Germany.
Well, quite. And that is a point of optimism that you said that there's a generation of young female scholars that might be engaged by this issue.
Yeah. And male scholars. I would like to point out that probably the leading scholar historian of the comfort women issue is a Japanese man, Yoshimi Yoshiaki. I mean, This is not just about that. I just think that the empowerment angle comes from young women who live in sexist societies today. South Korea has its problems. Japan has its problems. And for young women coming up in these societies to be able to see these problems through a historical lens and feel empowered by certain coming together of women across generations and across borders to hold people accountable.
Yeah, exactly. That coming together of women happened at a very particular moment when Ramsayer published that article.
Yeah, let's talk about, so without giving him too much attention because he doesn't deserve it, what I really want to know is, what is it about ultra-conservative white men that are drawn to ultra-conservative Japanese nationalism?
I'm going to ask you two. I mean, I know you're not ultra-conservative white men, but I do. So I'm raising a white boy in Japan, and I see the ambivalence towards his whiteness, towards his maleness, and he's quite small. And I heard.
How old is he?
I'm only 4, almost 5.
Yeah.
But I'm very maybe too aware of these things.
My girls are just about to turn 6, and they constantly surprise me with the things that I see them processing, that I go, this is much more deeper and complicated than I expected a 6-year-old to have to process.
Yeah. I mean, my kid told me the other day, he's like, Mom, Japanese people have English minds and English people have Japanese minds. And just no further elaboration.
What?
I think he meant English language. Sorry, Ollie. He just doesn't really understand that America English. He doesn't know that yet. But Ramsayer, one of the qualifications he often lists is that he went to kindergarten in Japan, and so my child also came to me and told me, Mama, I know everything about Japan because I was born in Japan. And I was like, no.
Yeah.
You're going to need better citation practices, kid.
Hey, Thanks very much for listening to this episode 83 of Japan by River Cruise. Thanks as ever to those who subscribe to the show. If you haven't already, then please do so. We release a new episode every single week.
Thank you to our guest this week, Chelsea Szendi Schieder. Chelsea, it was a pleasure talking to you. We have you on record somewhere as saying that you think it's okay to have contentious discussion and awkward conversation. So please come back.
Sure. I would love some more contentious discussion, awkward conversation. My introduction of my book is for free online, and please check out the fact-checking report I did with a team of historians of the Rams Era article as well.
We will link it in the notes, and we will see you next week.